be a very good shot. In the city of Corfinium, which lay across the Apennines due east of Rome, representatives of the various Italian cities gathered to formalize their alliance. They renamed Corfinium Italica and declared that it was the seat of a new government based on the Roman model, complete with its own senate and assemblies, but completely free of Roman rule. The immediate business of the new Italian government was the very war their existence had sparked. The Romans were not going to take this rebellion with grace and good humor, so preparations had to be made to withstand the inevitable onslaught. The Romans, quick with the rod, sent their consular armies out in opposite directions in 90 BC, one north and one south, to put the revolt down. To the north went the consul Publius Rutilius, who coaxed out of retirement his famous relative Gaius Marius to act as a military advisor. It didn't do much good, though, as Rutilius quickly led his army to a series of blundering, mistake-prone defeats. Finally, the consul made his one positive contribution to the war effort by getting himself killed. After the consul's death, Marius stepped into the leadership vacuum and quickly had the northern Italians on the run. With the situation in the north for the most part well in hand, the focus of the Romans turned south, where they faced the horrible déjà vu of crossing swords with the dreaded Samnites. Lucius Julius Caesar, the consul leading the Romans in the south, and the elder relative of a 10-year-old boy named Gaius, found the Samnites no less fierce an opponent than when last they met in battle. Caesar, along with his fellow commander Lucius Cornelius Sulla, watched in vain as the Samnites sacked a number of Roman towns. But they were finally able to halt the advance and keep the Samnites bottled up, while Caesar returned to Rome to oversee the consular elections. But before he left office, Caesar laid the political foundation of the war's end. It was inevitable, passed the Lex Julia, granting citizenship to those Italian cities who would not join the rebellion, and offering it to any Italian currently in revolt who laid down his arms. The vast majority of Italians, to whom independence had been an unwelcome state anyway, jumped at the chance. But the Samnites, and a collection of tribes in the north, continued to hold out. In 89 BC, Sulla was given full command of the southern troops and showed himself to be a brilliant tactician and leader of men. After saving a besieged legion at the city of Nola, Sulla was awarded the grass crown by the grateful soldiers whose lives he had saved. His fame was growing, and, to the people of Rome, Sulla emerged as the clear hero of the social war. This did not sit well with Marius, who had been maneuvered out of his command in the north when the Senate, afraid of the old consul returning to the political arena, gave the north over to Caepio, the son of the consul who had left Mallius out to dry during the war against the Gauls. But when Caepio fell in battle, Marius was sure he was destined to return to Rome the triumphant hero. But the Senate again thwarted him, and sent the consul Pompey Strabo, the father of Pompey the Great, north to take over. There was little Marius could do, and he was forced to play a subordinate role as Pompey laid a brutal siege to the town of Ascalon, which was the last city in the north holding out. Once Ascalon fell, the back of the resistance had been broken, and the fight went out of the Italians. By this time, most of them had already given up anyway, content with the fact that they had achieved exactly what they wanted, and would soon be full equals in a united Italy. Sulla wrapped up the last pockets of resistance in the south, and the brief social war was over. As a footnote, I should mention that during these years, a young noble named Cicero was punching the clock on his brief military career in order to qualify for the political career he really wanted, fighting both under Pompey Strabo and Sulla. Cicero had no taste at all for battle, and never made any secret that he disliked war. In later life, he was given a statue of Mars by a friend to add to his growing collection, and Cicero wrote in reply, "Why send me a statue of Mars? You know I'm a pacifist." But from 90 to 88 BC, young Cicero did what he had to do, and slogged around Samnium, knowing that no man in Rome could hope to lead without a few war stories to make him credible. Another young noble who cut his teeth during the social war was Gnaeus Pompeius, though his attitude towards battle was much more in keeping with the Roman tradition than the bookish Cicero. Only 17 at the time, He was called to action in 89 BC to serve with his father in the north and was presumably present during the siege of Ascalon. The young Pompey, if Plutarch is to be believed, already had an air of greatness surrounding him, and his fellow troops made comparisons to young Alexander the Great and Scipio Africanus. Pompey and Cicero had little in common personally, but in 40 years, the two men, all grown up and having reached the pinnacle of the political ladder, would find themselves on the same side of a bitter civil war against a man who at the time of the Social War was only 10. I often think that this was about the only time Pompey and Cicero would have proved a match for Julius Caesar, who, in his good time, would both outfight Pompey, Rome's greatest general, and outpolitic Cicero, Rome's greatest politician. But how were they supposed to know that? By the time Sulla remarked that in the teenage Caesar he saw many a Marius, it was probably too late. Remember, though, that sometimes the best way to win is to make sure that your opponent is still a child. The Social War was paradoxically both a war of unification and the last time for 70 years the Romans themselves were truly unified. In 88 BC, just as the Italian allies were being officially enrolled as full Roman citizens, Sulla was elected to his first consulship. In itself, it seemed a natural and innocuous choice. He was, after all, the hero of the most recent war, so who better to lead Rome? Besides, in the east, Mithridates, the king of Pontus, was hatching the first of his seemingly endless merry-go-rounds with the Roman legions. Who better, then, to march out and face this new threat in the east than the great Sulla? Well, according to the aging Marius, he was. And the old general became convinced that it was his destiny to lead the legions in the east. Unfortunately, he couldn't convince anyone else to back him. And why should they? Sure, he had been great in his prime, but it was a different age, and it was becoming clear that Marius was borderline senile, and clearly unable to wrap his head around the fact that the world was moving on without him. Sulla was young, dynamic, and clearly represented the future of Rome, so he was unanimously chosen to head up the armies headed east. Marius, bitter in defeat, decided that rather than go out quietly, he would order his hardcore partisans to do everything in their power to reverse the decision and place Marius himself back in charge. Sulla was forced to flee the city and made his way to the encamped legions, most of whom were loyal veterans of the Social War. But though he briefly held on to power, Marius's desperate, selfish grab triggered a wholly unprecedented response from Sulla, who did not take his eviction well. Pretty soon, word reached Marius and his partisans that the aggrieved consul was on his way back, at the head of a full consular army. Sulla, it seemed, was marching on Rome. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 33, Marius and Sulla. After emerging as the hero of the Social War, Lucius Cornelius Sulla had been elected consul in 88 BC. With the brief civil war put to rest, Roman attention was immediately diverted east, where Mithridates IV, king of Pontus, was located on the far side of the Aegean. Trouble had been brewing for years, and in 88 BC, Mithridates did not simply cross the line, he jumped over it. After several run-ins with the Roman legions garrisoned in the east, Mithridates decided that the Westerners had to go, and Anatolia should be returned to her native people. To this end, he initiated a mass slaughter that was to become known as the Asiatic Vespers. Enlisting the help of locals in cities across the Turkish peninsula, anyone who so much as spoke with a Latin accent was targeted for death. Over 80,000 Roman citizens and allies were murdered across the east, coinciding with the king's invasion of Asia. The Romans were justifiably horrified and immediately raised an invasion force to avenge the slaughter. Sulla was the natural choice to lead the invasion, But old Marius had his mind set on one last fling with glory, and arranged for the Senate's choice of Sulla to lead to be annulled by the people's assemblies. This annulment was guaranteed when armed gladiatorial bodyguards in the employ of Marius and his allies literally threw senators out of the Senate so a quorum could not be reached to overturn the original decision the Senate had come to originally. The introduction of mob violence into Roman politics precipitated by the Gracchi was starting to become less and less an exception and more the rule. Sulla was forced to flee for his life and made his way to the army encamped along the Adriatic. The army was ready for the planned invasion, but before they sailed east, Sulla would march them west. He incited the troops, most of whom were loyal to Sulla anyway, into a frenzy over the anti-democratic thuggery of Marius. Ready to follow Sulla anywhere, the consul pointed them towards Rome and announced that with their help, he was going to evict Marius from the city. His officers were appalled. It was illegal for the legions to cross the traditional city limits of Rome, and as much as they disapproved of Marius, they simply could not abide by Sulla's brazen flouting of the law. When they reached the city, all but one of Sulla's officers, a close lieutenant named Lucullus, refused to cross the line. Sulla respected their decision, but was not dissuaded from his plan, and took the troops right into Rome. Inside the city, Marian partisans organized gladiators and slaves into a defense force, but they were no match for trained legionnaires, and in the brief street fighting that ensued, Sulla's army had no trouble turning the pathetic defenders to heel. Marius himself barely escaped with his life and fled, along with his son, to Africa. Sulla restored order to Rome, had Marius declared an enemy of the state, and put the Senate back in control of the city. All of this drama filled the entirety of Sulla's year as consul, and it wasn't until 87 BC that he was actually able to lead his army out of the city to the east, where they should have already commenced the retaliatory campaign against Mithridates. But the minute Sulla left town, Marius began to plot his return. Many in Rome, who had been ambivalent in the political showdown between Marius and Sulla, had been pushed over to the Marian camp by Sulla's completely illegal and immoral seizure of the city. In 87 BC, the people of Rome did themselves no favors if they hoped to keep turmoil in the city to a minimum by electing as co-consuls Gnaeus Octavius, a staunch conservative and Sulla partisan, and Lucius Cornelius Cinna, a populare who was fast becoming the leader of the anti-Sulla forces in Rome. While not necessarily pro-Marius, Cinna nonetheless saw an alliance with the old general as an advantageous way to box out Sulla's allies. Throughout 87 BC, Octavius and Cinna clashed repeatedly, until Cinna was driven out of town by an angry mob. Once outside Rome, Cinna immediately began gathering men who were to help him fight his way back to power. Marius, meanwhile, was raising an army in Africa with the intention of following the precedent Sulla had just set by marching on Rome and capturing the city. When Marius crossed the short span of the Mediterranean back into Italy at the head of a loyal army, Cinna saw an opportunity to strengthen his own position. He formally joined with Marius, and the combined forces stormed into Rome. What followed was 5 straight days of terror and bloodshed. Marius simply released his army inside the city, with orders to kill anyone allied with, or suspected of allying with, or suspected of having the same name as someone who was allied with Sulla. Noble families fled or fought, depending on their disposition. Captured Sulla partisans were killed, and their heads were displayed in the